In the spring of 1963, at a farm liquidation sale outside of Bethany, Missouri, a 31-year-old woman named Lorene Pruitt paid $45 for something the auctioneer had nearly left off the list entirely. It wasn't a tractor, it wasn't a grain drill or a hay baler or any piece of equipment the 112 farmers standing in that muddy Harrison County field had driven out to see. What Lorene Pruitt paid $45 for was access to 11 acres of old apple orchard on the northwest corner of the Dellinger farm, the right to run her hogs through it for 2 full grazing seasons, and the privilege of hauling away whatever deadfall timber she could cut in the process. The auctioneer described it the way a man describes something he's embarrassed to be selling. 11 acres, he said, mostly volunteer grass, some wild onion, some ragweed, apple trees that haven't been sprayed or pruned since Eisenhower's first term, mites in the bark. Codling moth pressure going back years. You'll get some windfall fruit in August if the scab doesn't take it first. He paused. $45 gets you 2 seasons and the timber. He looked around the crowd. Somebody bid. The scrap lumber dealer from Ridgeway bid $15. Lorene bid $45. The lumber dealer looked at her once, shrugged, and put his hands back in his pockets. Nobody else moved. Her brother-in-law, Dale Pruitt, was standing 4 feet to her left when she raised her hand. He said, "Lorene, what in the world are you going to do with a moth-eaten apple orchard?" She told him she'd let him know when she figured it out. That was the story that left the sale that afternoon, and it traveled the way all stories travel in small farming counties. From the Dellinger sale, it went to the Harrison County Co-op on Tuesday. From the Co-op, it went to the Bethany Diner by Wednesday noon. By Sunday, it had reached the parking lot of the First Baptist Church on the north end of town. And somewhere between the Co-op and the diner, it had acquired a detail that wasn't in the original, that Lorene Pruitt had outbid 3 serious buyers and paid top dollar for 11 acres of sick trees and weeds. She had paid $45, but the story needed a fool, and $45 wasn't foolish enough to carry the weight the story needed, so the story made it something more. Let me tell you about Lorene Pruitt, because what she did with those 11 acres only makes sense if you understand who she was and who taught her to see the way she saw. Lorene was born in 1932 on a 160-acre mixed operation 6 miles southeast of Bethany, the second of 4 children and the only one who followed her father, Clem Acuff, into the fields and stayed there. Clem Acuff was not a remarkable man. By any measure, the county used to take stock of men. He didn't own the biggest farm or run the most cattle or drive the newest equipment. What Clem Acuff was, in a way the county never quite found language for, was a systems thinker in a world that didn't have that phrase yet. He farmed the way a watchmaker repairs a watch. Everything connected to everything else. Nothing wasted, nothing added that didn't serve at least 2 purposes. He kept hogs, and he kept an orchard, and he kept a flock of laying hens. And the relationship between those 3 things was not accidental. It was engineered quietly over decades in the way a man engineers something when he has no engineering degree, and no one to explain what he's doing and no reason to explain it anyway, because the results explained themselves every autumn when the books balanced and his neighbor's books didn't. Clem's hogs ran in the orchard every fall, had since the 1930s. The hogs ate the windfall apples, which kept the apples off the ground, which broke the codling moth's overwintering cycle in the soil and the fallen fruit. The hogs rooted through the leaf litter and turned the top 2 inches of soil under the trees, which disrupted the pupating moths before they could complete their emergence in spring. The hogs deposited nitrogen directly onto the orchard floor, which fed the trees without a dollar spent on fertilizer. The trees gave the hogs shade in summer and supplemental feed in fall, which cut the grain bill by an amount Clem tracked in a ledger he kept in the top drawer of his roll-top desk. Not because he enjoyed bookkeeping, but because the ledger told him the truth about his operation, and Clemma Cuff preferred truth to comfort. He taught Lorene to read that ledger before she was 12. He taught her to read the orchard before she was 14. He showed her the difference between a tree with codling moth pressure and a tree that had been cleaned under by hogs for 5 consecutive seasons. The difference visible in the bark, in the fruit set, in the color of the grass growing at the drip line. He had a saying he repeated so often it stopped sounding like a saying and started sounding like weather. The cheapest input is the one that does 2 jobs at once. Lorene heard it so many times, she stopped hearing it the way you stop hearing a clock. It became part of the background noise of how she thought. Clem died in the winter of 1958, when Lorene was 26. He left her the farm, 160 acres, with no mortgage, a herd of 41 hogs, a small orchard of 14 trees he'd planted in 1941, and the roll-top desk, with the ledger inside it. He left her the knowledge that the farm had been paid for in 1947, that it had never carried a loan since, and that the reason it had never carried a loan since was not luck or inheritance, but the discipline of a man who believed that a dollar owed to a bank was a dollar that belonged to someone else and could be taken back at a time of that someone else's choosing, not yours. Her brothers offered to help with the operation. She thanked them and said she'd call if she needed anything. She didn't call. By 1963, Lorene had been running the farm alone for 5 years. The hog herd had grown to 63 head. Her small orchard of 14 trees was producing, and the hogs were running through it every fall the way Clem had taught her. And the codling moth pressure on her trees was, by any measure she could observe, negligible. Her neighbors' orchards were not doing as well. The county extension agent had been through twice in 1961 and once in 1962, recommending a spray program. Lead arsenate first, then DDT, then a newer organophosphate compound, he described with the confidence of a man who had read the manufacturer's literature carefully. Lorene listened both times. She thanked him both times. She did not spray. Now let me tell you about the Dellinger orchard, because this is where the story stops being about Lorene Pruitt's farm and starts being about something the county wasn't going to understand for another 3 years. The Dellinger farm had been sold at liquidation because Harold Dellinger had died without a will, and his 3 children, none of whom farmed, had decided to divide the proceeds. The orchard on the northwest corner had been neglected since 1955. 8 years of no pruning, no spray program, no management of any kind. The trees were alive. 11 acres of them, a mix of Ben Davis and winesap, and a few older varieties Lorene recognized from the shape of the fruit and the angle of the scaffold branches as being close to what her father had planted. The codling moth pressure was severe. The apple scab was visible on the bark of the younger wood. The grass under the trees was rank and unbroken, years of fallen fruit rotting into it, each rotting apple a reservoir of larvae completing their cycle, undisturbed. That was what the county saw when it looked at the Dellinger orchard. 11 acres of sick trees and wasted ground. That's not what Lorene saw. What Lorene saw was 11 acres of trees that had been accumulating a codling moth population for 8 years without any management whatsoever, which meant the moth pressure was dense and concentrated and predictable in its location. She saw 11 acres of grass and leaf litter and rotting fruit that represented, in her father's language, the richest possible forage environment for a hog herd that needed exactly that kind of biological disruption work done. She saw trees that were structurally sound despite the neglect, their root systems established over decades, capable of full recovery if the cycle in the soil could be broken. And she saw something else, something she had been thinking about since the previous October, when she had walked the fence line between her property and the Dellinger place, and looked at those trees for a long time before she walked home and opened the roll-top desk and started doing arithmetic. That's why nobody understood the purchase. They were seeing impulse. They were watching execution. Because here is what Lorene Pruitt had done before she ever raised her hand at the Dellinger sale. In October of 1962, 6 months before the liquidation auction, she had driven to the Harrison County Extension Office and spent 2 hours with the agent's reference library, not asking questions, but reading. She had read everything available on the codling moth's life cycle: the overwintering behavior in soil and bark crevices, the emergence timing relative to degree days after petal fall, the role of fallen fruit as a larval reservoir, the specific depth in the soil at which pupating larvae were most vulnerable to physical disturbance. She had come home and written 4 pages of notes in the same ledger her father had used for the farm accounts, the pages immediately following the last entry Clem had made in December of 1957. She had then walked her own orchard and counted the hogs and done the arithmetic on what 63 hogs running 11 additional acres for 2 full fall seasons would cost her in supplemental feed, fencing, and labor, and what it would return in nitrogen deposition, pest disruption, and the value of the timber she could harvest from the dead and dying wood. The numbers worked. They worked because her hogs needed no additional feed to do the job. They were going to eat regardless. Routing them through 11 acres of apple orchard in fall cost her the fence materials and the time to move them and the $45. And it returned her a disrupted moth population across 11 acres of trees that were structurally worth recovering. She had figured it out before she ever bid. Let me tell you about the 2 seasons that followed, because this is where Lorene Pruitt proved that her father's arithmetic was not nostalgia. It was science that hadn't been named yet. She moved the first rotation of hogs into the Dellinger orchard in August of 1963, 3 weeks after the last significant windfall drop, when the ground under the trees was dense with fallen fruit in various stages of decomposition. She ran 31 head through in the first rotation, moving them in a rough pattern from the northwest corner toward the southeast, the way her father had taught her to rotate through any forage environment. Never let them strip one area completely. Always leave something. Always move before the ground is broken down to bare dirt. The hogs worked the orchard the way hogs work any environment they're given enough space to be hogs in. Systematically, rooting to a depth of 3 to 4 inches through the leaf litter and the top layer of soil, consuming every piece of fallen fruit they could locate, turning the ground under each tree in a way that no spray program and no cultivation equipment could replicate at the depth and specificity required to reach pupating larvae. She ran the second rotation through in October, a different group of 32 head, covering the ground the first group had missed, and going back over the areas of highest fruit density a second time. By the end of October, the ground under all 11 acres of Dellinger trees had been worked to a depth of 3 to 4 inches at least once, most of it twice, and the fallen fruit reservoir that had been building for 8 years was gone. She did it again in 1964. Both rotations, same pattern, same timing. The timber she harvested from the dead and dying wood, she cut herself over the winter of 1963 and 1964, working on weekends and evenings after chores, and she sold it to a sawmill outside of Gilman City for enough to cover the cost of the fencing materials she'd used to manage the hog rotations. The fencing materials had cost her $62. The timber brought her $78. The net cost of 2 full seasons of orchard management across 11 acres, including the original $45 access fee, was $29. $29. In the spring of 1965, when the apple trees on the Dellinger orchard came into bloom for the first time in years under any kind of management, Lorene walked the rows and looked at the new growth on the scaffold branches and the color of the bark on the younger wood, and the condition of the grass at the drip line. The scab was still present in the older wood. The trees needed pruning, years of it, to restore their structure. But the ground under the trees was different, you could see it. The leaf litter was broken down and incorporated. The soil surface was irregular and aerated in the way that soil is, when it has been worked by something living rather than something mechanical. And the codling moth pressure, as best she could assess it by the indicators her father had taught her to read, was a fraction of what it had been in 1963. A neighbor named Gerald Foss ran a small apple operation of his own 2 miles east of the Dellinger place. Gerald Foss had been on the county extension agent spray program since 1959. He was a careful farmer and a reasonable man, and he had no particular opinion about Lorene Pruitt, except that she was Clemacuff's daughter, and Clem had been a man worth knowing. Gerald drove out to the Dellinger orchard in May of 1965 because he had heard the story about the hogs, the version that had been circulating since 1963, the version in which Lorene had paid an absurd amount for 11 acres of worthless sick trees and then run pigs through them like a woman who didn't know any better. He walked the rows with her for 40 minutes. He didn't say much. He stopped at several trees and looked at the new growth and looked at the ground and looked at the bark. He took his cap off at one point and rubbed the back of his neck. He asked her what her moth pressure looked like on her home orchard, the 14 trees her father had planted. She told him. He asked her how long her father had been running hogs through the orchard. She told him since before she was born. He stood there for a moment with his cap in his hand. He said, "Your father knew something." She said, "Yes, he did." Gerald Foss went home and spent the rest of that spring thinking about what he'd seen. By fall, he had worked out an arrangement to run a portion of his own hog herd through his orchard in rotation. He didn't advertise this. He didn't explain it to anyone. But the farmers who knew Gerald Foss and knew that he was not a man who changed his practices without a reason began to ask questions, and the questions led back to Lorene Pruitt and the story that had been traveling through Harrison County since 1963 began to travel differently. It was no longer a story about a woman who had done something foolish. It was becoming a story about a woman who had done something that Gerald Foss, who had been farming for 30 years and had never once done a foolish thing, had decided to replicate on his own ground. If you have ever watched a community underestimate someone for years and then watched that same community go quiet when the evidence came in, stick with me. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next story I'm telling, because there are more of them, and they all end the same way. Let me tell you about what happened over the next 15 years, because this is where the story stops being about 11 acres of apple trees and starts being about something else entirely. Lorene Pruitt farmed. That is the simple version. The longer version is that she farmed the way her father had farmed, which is to say with the ledger open and the inputs examined, and the relationships between her enterprises tracked with the same attention a machinist gives to tolerances. She expanded the hog herd to 90 head by 1968. She planted an additional 22 apple trees on her home place in 1966, selecting varieties her father had noted in the ledger as performing well in Harrison County's particular combination of late spring frosts and summer humidity. She continued to run the hogs through the Dellinger orchard for 2 additional seasons after her original access agreement expired, having negotiated a new arrangement with the Dellinger heirs, who were by 1965 considerably more interested in the orchard's potential than they had been in 1963, for reasons that were visible in the new growth on the scaffold branches. She kept the ledger. Every year, every enterprise, every input and return. The hog operation paid for itself and generated a surplus. The orchard between her home trees and the managed Dellinger acreage generated a secondary income she had not had before 1963. She spent the surplus the way her father had spent surplus. She put it in the bank, and she left it there, not because she was afraid to spend it, but because she understood, in the way Clem had taught her to understand it, that $1 in the bank was $1 that could become land, and land was the only thing that didn't depreciate, didn't break down, didn't need a parts order from a dealer 3 counties away. By 1971, Lorene had $34,000 in savings. By 1975, she had $58,000. The farm was paid for. The equipment was paid for. She had no loans, no operating notes, no lines of credit. The extension agent who had recommended the spray program in 1961 and 1962 had retired by then, replaced by a younger man who drove out to her place in 1972 and spent an afternoon looking at her orchard management system with an expression Lorene recognized as the expression Gerald Foss had worn in 1965. The expression of a man rearranging what he thought he knew. The younger agent wrote a brief description of her hog orchard rotation system for the Missouri Extension Service's internal newsletter in the fall of 1973. He called it an integrated pest management approach, which was a phrase that had been in circulation in academic entomology since the late 1960s, but had not yet reached Harrison County in any practical form. He noted that the approach reduced codling moth pressure without chemical inputs, improved soil fertility under the trees, and generated a secondary return from the hog enterprise that offset the management cost entirely. He attributed the system to Lorene Pruitt of rural Bethany and noted that she had been running it since at least 1963, and that the original design appeared to predate her by at least a generation. Lorene read the newsletter item. She did not comment on it. She went back to work. You know what happened in the late 1970s and early 1980s. You know it the way people who lived through it know it, not as history, but as a specific kind of damage that left marks on the landscape that are still visible if you know where to look. Interest rates climbed through the floor of reason and kept going. The prime rate hit 21.5% in June of 1981. Corn prices collapsed. Land values, which had been inflating through the 1970s, and which a generation of Harrison County farmers had borrowed against as though the inflation were permanent, fell by half in some counties and by more than half in others. The farm credit system, which had been lending against inflated land values with the confidence of an institution that had never seriously considered the possibility that land values could go down, began calling notes. Farmers who had borrowed to expand in the 1970s, which was most of them, because the Extension Service and the agricultural lenders and the farm magazines had all been telling them to get big or get out, found themselves holding land that was worth less than they owed on it, and equipment purchased at peak prices with loans at rates that had seemed reasonable in 1976 and were catastrophic in 1981. In Harrison County, Missouri, between 1981 and 1986, 43 farms went to auction. Not equipment auctions, farm auctions, the kind where the family stands to one side and watches strangers bid on the place where the children were born. Lorene watched this. She watched it the way her father would have watched it. Not with satisfaction, never with satisfaction, but with a quiet sadness for the neighbors and a clear-eyed understanding of the mechanism. These were not bad farmers. Most of them were good farmers. They had borrowed because everyone told them to borrow, and they had expanded because everyone told them to expand. And when the rates went up and the prices went down, there was nothing to cut because the debt service was the fixed cost that couldn't be negotiated, and everything else was already lean. Lorene's expenses didn't change. They couldn't change. There was nothing to cut because there was nothing borrowed to begin with. Her hog operation ran on the same cost structure it had run on in 1963. Her orchard ran on the same cost structure her father had designed in the 1940s. The inputs were the animals she already owned, doing work they would have done anyway, in a system where each enterprise fed the next one, and the whole thing ran on the arithmetic of organisms rather than the arithmetic of credit. In the spring of 1983, the Wendell Coates farm, 240 acres of good Harrison County ground on the eastern edge of the county, went to auction. Wendell Coates had borrowed heavily in 1977 and 1978 to buy an adjacent parcel, and had been carrying the note at a variable rate that had been climbing since 1979. The auction was held on a Tuesday in April. There were 11 bidders registered, most of them representing agricultural land investment companies out of Kansas City and St. Joseph, the kind of buyers who appear at farm auctions during crisis years, the way certain insects appear after a fire, not causing the damage, but present because the damage has created conditions they can use. Lorene Pruitt registered as bidder number 7. She was 51 years old. The opening bid on the 240 acres was $480 per acre, which was below the county's depressed average for that year, and reflected the reality that the investment buyers in the room were not competing against each other so much as they were establishing a floor they didn't expect to have challenged. The bidding moved slowly. By $540 per acre, most of the registered bidders had dropped out. At $560 per acre, there were 3 bidders left: 2 investment company representatives and Lorene Pruitt. At $580 per acre, one of the investment representatives dropped. At $610 per acre, the second one looked at Lorene Pruitt for a long moment and dropped. The 240 acres sold to Lorene Pruitt for $610 per acre. Total, $146,400. She paid by check, drawn on the account at the Bethany Bank, where she had been depositing the surplus from the hog operation and the orchard since 1963. The check cleared the same day. The room went quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when a collective assumption collapses. Not the quiet of an empty room, the quiet of a room full of people rearranging everything they thought they knew about a woman they had been mildly amused by for 20 years. The auctioneer looked at the check for a moment before he stamped it. The investment company representative, who had dropped at $610 per acre, stood near the back of the room with his hands in his coat pockets and said nothing. Dale Pruitt, her brother-in-law, the man who had asked her at the Dellinger sale in 1963 what in the world she was going to do with a moth-eaten apple orchard, was standing near the door. He had not registered as a bidder. He was there because word had gotten around that Lorene was going to bid, and he had come because he wasn't sure he believed it and he wanted to see. He watched her sign the paperwork at the auctioneer's table. He didn't say anything to her right away. He waited until she was walking toward the door. He said, "Lorene." She stopped. He said, "Your father would have understood this." She looked at him for a moment. She said, "He designed it." She walked out. Let me tell you how this ends, because the ending is the part that Clemacuff would have understood without a word of explanation. Lorene farmed the combined 400 acres, her original 160, and the Coates 240, for another 19 years. She expanded the hog operation to 140 head by 1987 and integrated the Coates ground into the same rotation system her father had designed, running the hogs through the orchard ground in fall, tracking the inputs and returns in the same ledger, the same format Clem had used since before the Second World War. The pages now extending well past the ones Lorene had filled with her notes about the codling moth's life cycle in October of 1962. The orchard on the home place, now 36 trees, produced commercially for the first time in 1979 and continued producing through the 1980s and 1990s without a spray program. The codling moth pressure, by any measure she tracked, remained low. The soil under the trees remained in the condition that Gerald Foss had stood and looked at in 1965 with his cap in his hand. Alive, aerated, biologically active, in the way that soil is when something has been living in it and working it for decades. Gerald Foss retired in 1988. Before he did, he drove out to Lorene's place one afternoon and sat in her kitchen for an hour. He told her that he had been running hogs through his orchard for 23 years, that his moth pressure had been low for 20 years, that he had not sprayed since 1971, and that he wanted her to know that he understood now, fully, what her father had been doing and what she had been doing, and that he thought it was the most sensible thing he had ever seen done with 11 acres of sick trees and 63 hogs. She thanked him. She poured him coffee. She did not tell him that she had known all of this in October of 1962, sitting at her father's roll-top desk with 4 pages of notes and a ledger that balanced. In 2001, Lorene Pruitt was 69 years old and had been farming this same ground for 43 years. She began transitioning the operation to her niece, Carla Pruitt, who was 27 and had been working the farm summers since she was 14. Carla had learned the rotation system the way Lorene had learned it, by doing it season by season, moving hogs through orchard rows in fall, reading the ground afterward, reading the trees in spring. She had learned to read the ledger the way Lorene had been taught to read it, as a document that told the truth about the operation, not the version of the truth you wanted to hear, but the version the numbers produced, when you wrote them down honestly and added them up. The roll-top desk was still in the farmhouse. The ledger was still in the top drawer. It now contained 63 years of continuous entries in 3 different hands. Clemacuff's careful block printing from the 1930s through 1957, Lorene's smaller and faster cursive from 1958 through 2001, and the first entries in Carla's hand beginning in the fall of 2000, when Lorene had started having her keep the books herself rather than watching Lorene do it. Clem's tools were still in the workshop behind the house. The concrete floor, the wood stove, the workbench he had built from oak planks in 1938, the surface worn smooth and dark with decades of use. Carla had been using those tools since she was 14. She knew which drawer held the grafting knives and which shelf held the pruning compound, and where the spare hog ring pliers were kept, and why they were kept there. She knew this the way you know the layout of a place you have been working in since before you were old enough to understand what work was. In the spring of 2002, the Harrison County Farm Bureau held its annual meeting in Bethany. Lorene Pruitt was asked to speak. She was 69 years old and had not spoken publicly about her farming operation in 40 years of farming it. She stood up and said what she had to say in about 4 minutes. She said that in 1963 she had paid $45 for the right to run her hogs through 11 acres of sick apple trees. She said that the hogs had cost her nothing additional because hogs eat regardless of where you put them. She said that the trees had recovered because the moth pressure had been broken at the soil level, which was the only level at which it could be broken permanently. She said that the system had been designed by her father, Clem Acuff, who had been running it on his home orchard since the 1930s, and who had understood, without any formal training in entomology or soil science, that the cheapest input is the one that does 2 jobs at once. She said that she had paid $45 in 1963 and had not spent a meaningful dollar on pest management in her orchard in the 40 years since. She said that she had bought 240 acres of Harrison County ground in 1983 with money saved from an operation that had no debt in it, and that the reason the operation had no debt in it was that her father had taught her that a dollar owed to a bank was a dollar that belonged to someone else and could be taken back at a time of that someone else's choosing, not yours. She sat down. The room was quiet for a moment. Then it was not quiet. Dale Pruitt was in the room. He was 74 years old and had been farming his own ground for 50 years and had carried operating notes through most of the 1980s and had sold his North 40 in 1984 to make a payment and had never quite gotten back to where he'd been before the rates went up. He started to applaud. He was one of the first ones in the room to start. He kept applauding after most of the room had stopped. Let me ask you something. What do you see when you look at 11 acres of neglected apple trees with codling moth pressure and 8 years of fallen fruit rotting into the grass? Most people see worthless ground, a problem, something that would cost more to fix than it was worth. Lorene Pruitt saw a forage environment, a nitrogen source, a pest management opportunity, and the final piece of a system her father had spent 30 years building. She saw $45 of access and 63 hogs that were going to eat regardless. That's the difference between someone who buys and someone who builds. $45. A sick orchard in Harrison County, Missouri. A ledger and a roll-top desk with 60 years of truth in it. The 11 acres nobody wanted in the hands of the woman nobody understood, until the ground told them what she'd known all along.